Hello from me. My name is Ira McCook. I am from Homes England, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our summer learning programme. And this offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics that you've told us are of interest to you. And today's event is an overview of biodiversity net gain and how local authorities and other government agencies can be ready for its implementation in November 2023. Next slide, please. So, the summer learning programme is brought to you by Homes England Local Government Capacity Centre. This topic of this session is a particularly important focus for Homes England within its new strategic plan. And these slides show our mission and our objectives that are outlined in that strategic plan. The next slide summarises who we are in terms of the Local Government Capacity Centre and what we do. And we've established the centre following extensive research and consultation with you and local government and across a whole range of other partners to determine where local authorities need the most support and how we can best be delivered. So we look forward to hearing from you further at the slide and surveys at the end of the session. So next slide, please. So the agenda for today, obviously, I've covered the welcome and introductions. We've got three wonderful speakers to talk to you today. We've got Catherine Duggan from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, who's going to give you an update of where we are with biodiversity net gain. Rebecca Mobley from the Planning Advisory Service, who will give you an introduction to the Readiness Checklist. And last but by no means least, we've got a local authority case study from Buckinghamshire Council and our David Sutherland. Hopefully at the end, we'll have time for some Q&As, and I suspect we'll have a number of questions in the chat before we get a little bit of feedback and some polls at the end of the session. But without further ado, I'm going to now hand you over to our first presenter, and that's Catherine Duggan.
So hello, I'm Catherine Duggan. I work in Defra in the Biodiversity Net Gain team. I'm one of several people in the Defra Biodiversity Net Gain team working on several things. I can see a hand up, so that's good. Several people working on biodiversity net gain as within the department. A bit of background to me, I've got a background in environmental policy, so sort of several things in the kind of planning and environment sort of angle, but currently working on biodiversity net gain with a particular focus on local authority parts of biodiversity net gain. So next slide, please. So what I'm going to basically do for the first part of this session is kind of, it might be for people who answered up at the 5 end, a bit of a recap on sort of what is biodiversity net gain, some of the background and policy context for mandatory biodiversity net gain, which is what the sort of the government will be bringing in from November 2023. And then moving sort of around sort of some of the high level parts of the process, what the government has published in terms of some of the intentions for how it will be implemented. So what is biodiversity net gain? So net gain is an approach to development and or land management that aims to leave natural environment in a measurably better state than beforehand. Emphasis on the measurably sort of with the other lines there. So it's about achieving a measurable gain from sort of the pre-development sort of state sort of through the post-development state, sort of moving sort of from that baseline up to a sort of a higher level of biodiversity. So next slide, please. So why mandatory biodiversity net gain? So one of the things, obviously, there is a raft of existing protections within planning policy. It's best to say upfront that biodiversity net gain does not do anything to existing protections within sort of biodiversity policy. So, for example, statutory protected sites, protected and important species and irreplaceable habitats, those are sort of unaffected by biodiversity net gain. But within sort of planning policy, why biodiversity net gain? Some policies are, so there can be compensation included. There are sort of losses with it on a sort of case-by-case basis, but other habitats such as scrub may be recognised in planning policy, but they are sometimes, but not often, subject to compensation requirements. So moving on to a mandatory biodiversity net gain approach, all of these habitats within the planning sort of area will be recognised and measured using a biodiversity net gain metric, and they will be sort of compensated for on a consistent basis using a sort of a single tool across the national approach. So next slide, please. So where did it come from? Biodiversity net gain was the trajectory was set by the 25-year environment plan. That's an out that government will embed a environmental net gain principle for development, including housing and infrastructure. So the government consulted on making the achievement of a net gain for biodiversity mandatory within planning permissions. And that was sort of brought through and consulted on, and from sort of 2019 there's been a commitment to introducing that mandatory biodiversity net gain. Next slide, please. So moving on from the 25-year environment plan, recently the government's published the environmental improvement plan. So within that, the government sort of restated its ambition to for biodiversity net gain from November 2023. Biodiversity net gain is one of sort of several policies within the thriving plants and wildlife goal, designed to sort of minimise the impact from development on nature as part of a wider package of other sort of interventions that are sort of set out within the environmental improvement plan. Within the EIP, the government also sort of committed to providing more support to local authorities, and earlier this year there was a commitment for sort of funding to be made, of which some has been already sort of distributed. So that's kind of gives the sort of overarching environmental policy context. Next slide, please. So the framework for mandatory biodiversity net gain is clauses within the Environment Act. So this achieved royal assent back in November 2021. And it includes a package of new duties and tools and support for nature, which included the provisions for mandatory biodiversity net gain. So a 10% increase in biodiversity for planning permissions, a strengthened biodiversity duty on public authorities, sometimes referred to as the NERC Act, but enhanced duty, local nature recovery strategies, of which there was further information and published recently on local nature recovery strategies that's available on gov.uk. Including guidance, and conservation covenants, which are a mechanism for securing environmental improvements between a landowner and a responsible body. So as a package, those sort of new package of tools altogether sort of lay the foundation for sort of a set of interventions that will build a nature recovery network and inform sort of nature recovery on the ground. Next slide, please. So that's the kind of environmental background. Moving on to biodiversity net gain within the planning system. So the biodiversity net gain as a policy has been in the National Planning Policy Framework for a while. Within the current biodiversity, so NPPF, the sort of key paragraphs are sort of paragraph 174 and 179. So there is existing policy of providing a net gains for biodiversity. And pursuing opportunities for securing measurable gains within biodiversity. And it's fair to say that several local authorities already have and have had for a while existing biodiversity net gain policies. The number, I think, is increasing in terms of the number that have got or are looking to put a biodiversity net gain policy in place. But currently there is obviously existing policies in place. What I'm sort of talking about in terms of mandatory biodiversity net gain is what the Environment Act will bring in, which will be a national approach that will require 10% for eligible planning applications. But with it, at the moment, people can currently also have policies in place for biodiversity net gain. Next slide, please. So the key components of mandatory biodiversity net gain, it's an England-only policy, so it only applies to development in England. As I said before, it's 10% gain. It is based on a biodiversity metric, which I'll go into a little bit further in a minute. Habitats that are secured via biodiversity net gain need to be secured for at least 30 years. Biodiversity net gain, there will be a biodiversity net gain register for offsite land, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. It does not change existing legal protections, as I said before. So it definitely doesn't. It's an additional policy on top of existing protections. And mandatory biodiversity net gain, as set out in the Act, will go live from November for most developments subject to the Town and Country Planning Act, and there will be a longer transition for smaller sites. So these will apply from April 2024. Slightly separately, but nationally significant infrastructure projects will also will follow in 2025, subject to further consultation. So moving on to the next slide, please. So developers will have a few options for achieving biodiversity net gain. So this is mandatory biodiversity net gain. So when considering the site and looking at the impacts, The first option will be to avoid to look at the on-site option. So what is available on-site, and where could the biodiversity net gain be put? So is it possible to avoid impacts or enhance biodiversity on the site? And that's the increasing preference. And this is something obviously the application of a mitigation hierarchy, which seeks to avoid first, then minimise, and then as a last resort compensate. So looking at on-site options where that's possible. In some locations, it may not be possible or may not be preferable for all gains to be put on-site. So these could be secured away from the existing the development site. So enhanced on other land holdings by purchasing something called biodiversity units from third parties. The one on the right of the screen is statutory biodiversity credits. So these are only available in connection to biodiversity net gain. These statutory biodiversity credits will be available as a last resort and sold by government, by Natural England on behalf of government, and invested in habitat creation. So these are a last resort where there is other options are not available. So that's effectively where the gains could be put. So moving on to the BNG process overview. I appreciate this is probably a little bit small having had a look at it now on here. So hopefully you can sort of see it, but this is a very high level overview of the biodiversity net gain process. So starting from left to right, there's obviously the pre-commencement condition would be applied. So there would be a 10% requirement for all eligible planning applications that would need to achieve a 10% net gain. Looking at that, then obviously there's step 2, moving on to you would look at the site survey and look at what was there, use the biodiversity metric to calculate what habitats are already on site or biodiversity units. So it's area habitat, linear habitat and hedgerows. Look at that and factor that into potentially the land price. Look at options for on-site design. If there's no options available in terms of on-site design, moving to off-site design. And then as a last resort, statutory credits. This would all need to be put considering obviously other industry standards and what could be in a local nature recovery strategy for where and how enhancement could be put together into a biodiversity gain plan, which will need to be approved by the planning authority before development can commence and proceed. There's probably another one on the other side, which is then obviously the 30 years after that process is finished, moving on to monitoring as well over the 30-year period to ensure the gains are delivered over the 30 years. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned a couple of times now biodiversity metric. So the biodiversity metric underpins biodiversity net gain. It's been around for a while. It's been published by Natural England, but the powers within the Environment Act allow the Secretary of State to publish a statutory version of the metric. So it's a tool which quantifies biodiversity gains and losses. So effectively, you can have a look at what is on a site. You can have a look at the habitat. You can score them based on the size, distinctiveness and condition, and that would make up your pre-development biodiversity score. You then need to obviously achieve your 10% gain, and there are a number of factors that are considered as part of that. And the metric includes a number of risk factors, obviously for post-development, which includes things like the difficulty to create, time to target condition, and the distance from the site. So using the biodiversity net gain metric allows quantifiable biodiversity gains and losses to be measured. It embeds the core principles of biodiversity net gain, including the mitigation hierarchy. So there are incentives within the metric which consider the distance from the existing development site and how far that away any gains are put. It effectively has some incentives to try and bring those as close as possible, and it provides confidence and consistency in approach basically across, and it will be a statutory metric across the whole of England. So next slide, please. So just a little bit of a recap of the government earlier in 2022 undertook a consultation on a lot of the detail that will make up mandatory biodiversity net gain. There is a consultation outcome that is on gov.uk, but in brief, some of the core parts of what will make up mandatory net gain. The government intends to make some exemptions, it's worth saying up front, so it will apply to most public applications, but there are some exemptions, and the government has indicated that there will be some exemptions, so development impacting habitat of an area below a de minimis threshold. 25 metres square or 5 metres for linear habitats such as hedgerows. So they biodiversity net gain won't apply to those. Householder applications and permitted development and urgent crown development are also exempted or will be exempted. And biodiversity gain sites, so where the habitat is actually being created for biodiversity net gain, and small-scale self-build and custom house building also proposed to be exempt from the eventual requirement. So next slide, please. So another part I mentioned earlier that obviously it doesn't replace existing protections. So the net gain requirement will be disapplied for irreplaceable habitats. It's not means because obviously irreplaceable habitats are irreplaceable, so they have their own sort of policy and requirements around them. So the proposal is to obviously disapply biodiversity net gain from irreplaceable habitats, so that they're treated separately as a separate under a separate policy. So the government was also provide a small sites metric for use on smaller sites. So there's a recognition that smaller sites may need to use a small sites metric, which has got some process easements in it, which allow it's slightly less sort of there's slightly less in it to use, but a proportionate for small sites basically. Development must have an approved biodiversity gain plan prior to commencement, as I mentioned. And planning enforcement regime will be the principal way of enforcing delivery of biodiversity net gain. And proportionate monitoring arrangements will be set out as part of legal obligations to secure the site. So next slide, please. So I mentioned about offsite. So when developer has options, obviously there's a preference in terms of the mitigation hierarchy of seeking on-site gains, and that's incentivized within the metric. But where there is off-site biodiversity, any landowner can provide biodiversity units. So these are enhancements of biodiversity anywhere. If they meet the eligibility criteria, all of those units must be legally secured for 30 years and be registered on something called the Biodiversity Gain Sites Register. So there will be a national register that's being created. It'll be an online register where anybody who wants to provide offsite BNG must be legally secured, these units, and they must be registered on the Biodiversity Net Gain Register, and that will be publicly accessible and available to see in terms of what gains have been secured away from the development site, and similar to the way that obviously planning registers obviously have for planning applications. Suppliers of units can supply to anywhere in England, provided the units are suitable for the development in question. And the distance between the development and the units is properly accounted for in the metric. So they need to be suitable. There are trading rules within the metric, so you can only train like for like or higher. You can't sort of downgrade the amount of net gain, and they need to be obviously properly accounted for within sort of the distance they are from the development site needs to be properly accounted for. Developers can sell excess units. So on the site, if excess are created, as long as they're registered and they are genuinely additional, they will be allowed to be used for other developments. Habitat created after the 30th of January 2020 is eligible for mandatory biodiversity net gain. So that date is the date the Act was introduced. So any sort of habitat enhancement from that date is eligible for mandatory biodiversity net gain. And guidance has been recently published. And I think there's some links at the end of this session on stacking units with other environmental payments. So it is possible to, in certain circumstances, obviously sort of put certain payments together to where there is different environmental outcomes. Next slide, please. So statutory biodiversity credits, as I mentioned, these are a last resort to prevent planning delay. They are specific to mandatory biodiversity net gain and are created under the Environment Act for the purposes of mandatory biodiversity net gain. Natural England will sell statutory biodiversity credits, but the aim is to phase these out as the market matures, the private market with offsite units. Statutory credits will be priced in a level intentionally uncompetitive to the market. And this will be reviewed at 6 monthly intervals. Credits will be invested in habitat creation enhancement by Natural England, and the Secretary of State will publish an annual report on credits under the Act. Next slide, please. So just a final sort of bit from me before I think we move on to Becky and more of the detail about readiness. Biodiversity net gain implementation. So in the consultation, there was announced some funding for local planning authorities. So there's been 2 pots that have been distributed so far. There's 4.18 was distributed in 2021-22, and a further 16.71 million earlier this year. The government's continuing to work on several areas prior to implementation. So development of secondary legislation. So some of the processes and procedures will require some secondary legislation. So government is working on that. There'll be publication of that statutory metric. Obviously, Biodiversity Metric 4.0, which is currently out there, has already been published, and the government has consulted on the statutory biodiversity metric, but there will be publication of the final metric. I mentioned the system to sell credits, and obviously the system to register offsite biodiversity gains. That's also in development and will be made available before biodiversity net gain goes live. And working on publication of further guidance. So there are links, I think, later on to several pieces of guidance that are already available on gov.uk about mandatory biodiversity net gain and some of the aspects of it. Which there will be links to. And then there is also work going on in terms of looking at monitoring and evaluation, making sure that biodiversity net gain as it's operating is getting feedback and also sort of providing assurance that it's achieving its intended outcomes at the end of the day. So I think that's all from me, and I'm handing over to Becky Mobley, who I think is going to talk through Biodiversity Net Gain Readiness Checklist.
Great, many thanks, Catherine. That's great. Hi, everyone. I'm Becky Mobley. I work for the Planning Advisory Service, where I'm leading a project getting local authorities ready for biodiversity net gain. So I'm going to talk today a bit about preparing for biodiversity net gain and biodiversity net gain readiness for local authorities. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm really interested to know how ready you think you are at the moment. So this is a question we've been asking throughout this project, which we've been running for a couple of years now. So it's really interesting to hear how you feel about that. And I was actually on an event this morning with the planner where we asked the same question. So we're getting lots of info on that. So if you could just answer this one, I'll leave that running. Just close that. Yeah, it's looking like we've got lots of 2s and 3s and quite a few 1s as well. Only a couple of 5s, so only a couple feeling very well prepared. And that's sort of consistent with what we generally see. I think there's a lot to be done and a lot of information to understand around this topic. So hopefully we can help you a bit today. Okay, brilliant. Right, if I could have the next slide, please. So just to explain a little bit about PAS. So PAS, the Planning Advisory Service, we sit within the Local Government Association and we're a team of 11. We're mostly funded by the Department for Levelling Up, and we're basically here to support English planning authorities, and that's with issues across the planning spectrum. So that's both from the existing planning system, but also new reforms coming in. So the project that I'm working on has been funded by Defra for 3 years. So we started in March 21. And it's part of a wider programme that we have on the environment, actually. So we do some work on nutrient neutrality, which some of you I know from the chat will be aware of, and also nature recovery. The aim of the project is to help local authorities to be day one ready when biodiversity net gain becomes mandatory. And the way we do that is we have a lot of peer-to-peer learning. It's really been really helpful to hear from others, and you guys are going to hear from David from Buckinghamshire Council very shortly to explain what they've been doing. But there's loads of good practice out there in terms of what's being done already on biodiversity net gain, and lots of places already doing this. We have a practitioner network which has an online forum, and we hold regular meetings of that to share examples, case studies, ask questions. And we also have lots on our web pages as well. And we run workshops and events, and all of those are recorded and available on our website as well. We also act as a bridge between local authorities and government, so work very closely with Catherine and others in her team in Defra, and also with Natural England and DLURC, as well as other stakeholders in this space to sort of feedback what we're hearing from local authorities and to help with guidance and that sort of thing. And one of the other things is really, because we work across the planning system with local authorities, is trying to understand how this all joins up. So with upcoming planning reforms, with other aspects relating to the environment. You know, how does BNG fit within that? So that's what we do. If I could have the next slide, please. Okay, so Catherine's already talked a lot about the national context. I won't go into everything that's on this slide because it's quite a complicated slide. But just to understand, as we've said already, all bar exempted and small sites will, all planning applications will require biodiversity net gain from November 2023. And I know we had a question in the chat about whether that was at submission or whether it was planning applications already in the system. We understand it's going to be at submission, and there'll be the secondary legislation will cover off how that will be dealt with. So in terms of this slide, I had to produce these slides a little bit early. So actually, this is just showing what we already have out there. So we've got guidance, we've got the metric, we've got consultation response, we've got lots of other guidance and information out there. We also actually do have confirmed who the local nature recovery responsible bodies are going to be and their funding. So that needs to flip across to the other side. We are just waiting lots of information really around the details of this, but we do have lots of information on how we expect that to work in the consultation response, as Catherine's outlined. Okay, so I'm going to flip over to the next slide, please. Okay, so we run a lot of events with local authorities, so these are some recent polls that we've run through events just to find out, you know, how local authorities are getting on. So you can see from this one, the last event we ran, we had over 80% of the local authorities folk joining had started working on BNG. I'm always intrigued by the 9% who didn't know, because they've joined a webinar on BNG but don't know if they're doing it yet, but you know, we won't go there. And very much people feel most comfortable around delivering policy and understanding what's in policy, and that's really been consistent across the project actually for the last couple of years. Probably struggling more in terms of monitoring and reporting. How do you do that side of things, and maybe offsite delivery. And then in terms of the sort of key points that come up, local authorities are really interested in how biodiversity net gain fits into wider corporate priorities and also links into the local nature recovery strategies that are coming through the Environment Act. And this has been a real key thing for local authorities that are already doing BNG is how does it link to other priorities, and how can it deliver those? And we've seen lots of examples of those that have come forward with biodiversity net gain early. It's probably due to priorities beyond biodiversity and nature, which is really interesting. So for example, Salford in their local plan, they very much linked it into fairness and addressing deprivation issues, while Cornwall in their development plan document on the climate emergency have included BNG in there. So it's not just coming from that approach of addressing the nature crisis. There are obviously concerns around, you know, understanding resourcing and the clarity and certainty of funding, and I've seen some questions in that on the chat. Also, what evidence do you need to support biodiversity net gain, particularly if you're putting it in your local plan? And what skills and expertise do you need in-house? Really just reflections that we really want the regulations and guidance as soon as possible. And I think some you know, questions really around what's the role in of the local authority in addressing the mitigation hierarchy of ensuring on-site first, then off-site locally, and then as a last resort, national credits, and how is that going to actually pan out in reality? And then some questions, as I said already, around monitoring enforcement. A lot of local authorities are interested in going above the mandatory requirement and how that might work. Guildford just recently adopted their local plan with 20% biodiversity net gain. It's supported by quite a lot of evidence. To get through our examination, they needed that evidence. So that is definitely needed if you're going to go above those requirements. And yeah, just the valuation of working with others really, and how important that is. Okay, next slide, please. So one of the things we've been really thinking about in talking to local authorities is how you get ready for biodiversity net gain. Now, to comply with the Environment Act, the only thing you need to be able to do, and I say only, not saying that that's simple and easy to do, but just to recognise, is you need to be ready to receive and determine planning applications with biodiversity net gain from November for most sites, and then obviously from April for small sites. And we don't have, as we've said already, all the information on how this is going to work, but you can definitely still get started. And it's very important to at least think and plan for how you'll get ready. And thinking beyond DM will actually make the most of those opportunities for wider benefits. And that's something we're really seeing from local authorities that are already going ahead. Yeah, as I said already, there's really lots of good practice out there to learn from. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what we've just been working on over the last couple of months is a readiness checklist for local authorities. So we have just recently published this actually on Monday. I'll put the link in the chat when I finish talking. And we've divided this up into 6 themes around thinking around how you can prepare for biodiversity net gain. Now, some of these are things that you really going to have to do in order to be sort of legally compliant, but a lot of them are really to support that legal compliance approach. And so we have shaded in the tool to try and flag which we feel are most required. And we've worked with local authorities on this. It's based on existing experience, including Buckinghamshire, who you're going to hear from. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk a little bit around the checklist, and it really starts at the review. And this is really around, what do you want your approach to be? How proactive do you want to be? Do you want to just focus on the development management side and making sure you can process less planning applications? Or do you really want to think about how biodiversity net gain can deliver best for nature and people in your place and how you might do that? So we've picked out some key actions around those, and they include looking at evidence and data. It's very likely that there's already a partnership around that does this in your area, and particularly now we know that local nature recovery strategies are coming in, working with them because they will be looking at this data and evidence. Thinking about how BNG fits with your wider corporate priorities and objectives, and it almost definitely will, but that can be really helpful in terms of taking it forward. Think about related strategies and plans. How does it link into delivering green infrastructure? And in particular, your local plan. What does your local plan say about this? And that's going to be the policy requirements, but compare it to what's going to be coming mandatorily and how that will work in terms of what you've got in policy and what's going to be required legally. Do you want to take a role in the offsite market? Do you want to take a more proactive role to make sure there will be local sites available for biodiversity net gain? And there's all sorts of roles you could take. David's going to talk about what they're doing in Buckinghamshire. Hertfordshire County Council, for example, just recently released a biodiversity net gain Tinder process where they match developers and biodiversity net gain offsite providers, which is great. But there's all sorts of roles you could take, including using your own site, your own estate for biodiversity net gain units. But it's really deciding what you want to do there, whether you want to sit back or whether you want to try and support that market. And also deciding on your local approach. Where do you want that offsite to go? And how do you want to encourage to make sure that that happens locally and perhaps not resorting to local national credits? Next slide, please. Then you will need some additional resource to do this to help support development management planners, but ecologists won't be able to look at every single planning application. So you'll also need to think about training up and existing staff, and how much resource you need, as well as who you need to train up, will depend on what you've decided to take as your approach. And so, it's definitely worth thinking about how you're going to do this and who you need to involve. Next slide, please. And it's really around communicating as well with everybody you want to, both externally and internally, and letting them know what your approach is. You want to talk to partners, neighbouring authorities and parishes if you're taking quite a proactive approach. But as a bare minimum, you definitely want to update planning committee members. And also thinking about council teams beyond planning, particularly if you're taking, approach to offsite biodiversity net gain. And some local authorities have done a green call for sites, basically looking for sites where biodiversity net gain can be delivered rather than just the traditional development sites. So that's quite an interesting approach as well. Okay, next slide, please. And then just thinking about how you are going to take this forward strategically. And I think one of the key things is we think that you will need some kind of implementation plan and to have appropriate governance for that, just to get ready for biodiversity net gain. Even if you're focusing just on the development management side, there are some actions to take forward that you'll need to think about. And then you need to look at that biodiversity evidence base and see how you're going to find what you're see how you're going to move on from that and use it to inform biodiversity net gain approach. You might want to carry out a needs, supply and market readiness assessment to see what you think the need's going to be for offsite delivery and how likely it is that it's going to happen locally. Quite a few places have done that. And then just work out what your offer is going to be and really formalise that and get that set up. And then a really important one. So these are all, these are all things that you could do. But a really important one in terms of supporting this is to look at your local plan. And obviously you can't, if you're not already at the stage of examination really in your local plan, you're not going to be able to implement a local plan policy before November or even an SPD. But it's really worth thinking about how you might want to set out local circumstances and requirements and how BNG fits in with other local strategies in your local plan. So going beyond what's just set out in the legislation. You don't need to repeat what's already in the legislation in there, but you probably want to think about how it applies locally. And again, we've got loads of really good examples on our website of good planning policies and SPDs. Next slide, please. Okay, and then on to development management, which is really key. Most of these will need to be thought about. You'll need to think about whether you need to update your IT systems. If you have a pre-app service, thinking about biodiversity early on in the process is really, really important to get it right. And obviously also generates income for you. So if you can integrate that into your pre-application service and into advice, that would be really, really useful. If you have local validation requirements, you'll need to update those. We understand that the national validation requirements will be updated, but obviously if you've got any local requirements, you'll need to think about those. And also how you do internal triage and consultation. When will you consult experts? When will DM planners need to get that ecological expertise to help them with these applications? Think about templates. You might want to explore Section 106 templates, condition templates. And also then it may be that some of the DM planners are particularly interested in this side of things, so you might want to identify with a special interest. Lots of places have already developed developer guidance notes, which set out what you want developers to provide with planning applications. And again, those are found to be really, really useful in terms of setting out some of this detail. So again, we've got some really good examples of those on our website. Next slide, please. Okay, and then we move on to monitoring and enforcement and reporting. Now, monitoring of the actual sites is going to be done by developers, but you will have to think about how, as a local authority, you'll keep track of that, understand how you recover the costs, and really make a monitoring plan for how you're going to do this, because you probably won't be able to do every site. So how are you going to take an approach to that, and what will you do? And there's also a duty to provide reports on biodiversity net gain to government, which you'll need to think about. And then obviously thinking about monitoring and enforcement requirements and integrating those into your current practices. Okay, so that's kind of what our BNG Readiness Checklist covers at the moment. It's in draft. We're really interested to hear feedback from those trying it out from a local authority point of view. So I will post the link when we're done with the presentation. If I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, so just to sum up, as a bare minimum, you need to be ready to receive and determine planning applications with biodiversity net gain for all but small sites from November, and then for small sites from April next year. But there's lots you can get started with now to prepare, and this goes beyond your DM service. Biodiversity net gain is a really great opportunity for planners and local authorities. Yes, there's lots of detail and it's a bit scary, but it can really deliver locally, both for people and nature. And lots of local authorities have been preparing for some time, so there's really good practice and experience out there. Collaboration and working together is going to be key. And Paz is here to help. Do look at our website for more information. And if you are a local authority officer and would like to join our network, please do get in touch. I'll put our contact details in the chat. Thank you. And I want to hand over to David now from Buckinghamshire Council, and he's going to talk more about exactly what Buckinghamshire Council are doing in terms of getting ready for biodiversity net gain.
Thanks, Becky. Yeah, hi, my name's David Sutherland. I suppose, work for Buckinghamshire Council. So my background is I'm a chartered planner by background. So work through the kind of a planning department up to head of planning and environment level. Now working primarily in terms of getting our authority ready for everything to do with the Environment Act. So that's been my primary focus. Hence, I've been involved with net gain, local knowledge recovery strategies. As an authority, we're a new unitary. We were 1 county and 4 districts. As of 3 years ago, we became a unitary, and I think we're now the second biggest planning authority in the country. Very high levels of growth in the county, but predominantly a rural county with protected landscape. So we've got a really delicate balance to kind of keep there. And it's also worth pointing out we were one of the pilot authorities to test the process for local knowledge recovery strategies. Just in terms of the overview, in terms of my presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to very much follow Becky in terms of her readiness checklist, just so you can see, I suppose, what we've done in relation to the checklist that PAS have prepared. So that's the kind of the format that I'm just going to follow over the next kind of 15, 20 minutes. And what I would just say is that, there was a lot that we don't know still in terms of the guidance and secondary regs, and we've just adapted and we've changed our approach in terms of our preparedness, recognizing that new guidance is coming and that we're just going to have to, I suppose, accept that. And this is new policy being implemented. So I think we've just kind of adapted our approach as we've gone, as guidance has emerged. So next slide, please. So Becky talked about that kind of wider context, and I think that's really important in terms of setting the scene for ourselves, in terms of why, I suppose, we went early, or we've put a lot of time and effort into this. And if I can just, I suppose, highlight, I suppose, the first image on the right. So our growth board has incorporated, I suppose, the natural environment, recognised the importance in terms of Buckinghamshire, the natural environment, as part of its growth vision. So it's highlighted the role of the natural environment, the importance of that as part of the growth, and it's recognised that in terms of the actions that it's going to follow. So it specifically mentions biodiversity net gain, what it wants to achieve and by when. It talks about implementing, the local knowledge recovery strategy and other actions under the Defra 25-year plan and being an exemplar of that. So it kind of sets that into the wider political context that's got that wider political buy-in. We've also picked it up in our corporate plan for Buckinghamshire Council, and also the climate change strategy, which we put through a couple of years ago through our cabinet. Again, that's got nature-based solutions as a real key part of it, recognising the interlinked kind of issues of kind of climate change and the biodiversity crisis. And I think, again, just referring back to the our growth board vision, they've almost again put a marker in there of their aspiration to go beyond 10%. Hence, I think an indication to, as and when we get to our next local plan, they want to test going beyond the 10% that's being mandatory required. We've had to take some early decisions on the offsite market, where we're going to engage with that. Our thinking has changed, so I think that's just a recognition of that's changed as the kind of the guidance has emerged. We're now looking at kind of a more regulatory role, as previously we were looking much more, going down the tariff route, and we're now looking to in terms of much more regulatory role. And I'll come on to that in terms of our interaction with kind of habitat banks. And I just think in terms of our statutory role, we've also had to make some decisions in terms of decisions to be made as well in terms of our own land holdings. And again, I'll kind of come on to that in terms of the approach that we're taking in respect of our own land holdings. So just moving on to the next slide, please. So focusing on, I suppose, the resources and skills sections, I think, very quickly we recognised that knowing we had that political commitment in terms of they wanted to kind of go early on this, what was it that we needed to do to kind of prepare and bring resource in? So we kind of took a decision to bring resource in early. We recruited 1.6 FTE net gain officers. So we kind of came up with a job description at the time that we thought we were going to need. Again, that's changed slightly in terms of what those officers are doing. In terms of looking at it now, around about 0.4 of an FTE is looking at our own land holdings with estates, writing up the management plans for those. And 1.2 FTE has been we're kind of working on our internal procedures, our liaison with habitat banks, commenting on biodiversity net gain management and monitoring plans and the more complex metric submissions. And interestingly, in terms of habitat bank cost calculator and monitoring fees calculator, which I know there's a question in the chat about. And as I said, the role has changed since we've kind of recruited the net gain officers. And that's just a kind of the recognition of how our approach has changed as we've been going through our preparedness. This is on top of I suppose a core ecology team that was formed when we went unitary, and it kind of equates to I suppose one ecologist. So in the ecology team, there's one ecologist effectively to what would have been each district, and these kind of 1.6 is on top of that. So that just gives you an idea of the additional resource we've brought in, and that does kind of equate and tally up with the study that was undertaken by ADEPT and Defra in terms of, I suppose, the resource that you need to bring at a county level. So hopefully that's what we've gone with, and we obviously took a financial I suppose risk, in relation to doing that. I'll cover the internal governance because I think that's important. We kind of set that up early. Two parts to that. Just in terms of we set up a working group that covers a number of disciplines across the council. So we meet monthly on that, and that includes legal colleagues, estates, finance, planners, and ecologists and comms. So, and that looks at our overall approach across the council, making sure that we understand what's kind of going on. And then we have a bi-weekly user group, where we look at much more of the detail that we're doing on specific issues and issues that are coming up and how we problem solve it. We've got an action to decision log, and we've got a project plan, which has been changing as we've gone along. But that was just the kind of governance that we put in place. Next slide, please. In terms of communication, again, really important, and there's lots of people to communicate with. So, you know, as we've kind of developed our approach, we've updated our parish councils forum. We have a local developer and agent forum. And we've just said, look, this is our trajectory to net gain. This is what we're doing, just so they're up to date and aware of our approach. We've held a number of training sessions with our development management colleagues and other teams internally. Again, setting up the context, what's coming, what we're doing locally, and I'll kind of come on to that in terms of our supplementary planning document. And who does what, I suppose, the logistics of what an ecologist does, what a planner does, so on and so forth. So we've kind of gone into that nitty-gritty of detail. A couple of weeks ago, we held a session for our planning committee members, again, just to, I think, highlight this is coming, the importance of it, what they're going to need to look out for, but also I think, you know, our approach locally and how we're addressing it. And interestingly, importantly, we're really keen to get our offsite market up and running. And obviously, so we've been having also discussions with at least 5 habitat bank providers, and I suppose biodiversity net gain unit providers locally, just so we can have that active dialogue. And there's a lot in terms of that are looking in terms of to provide offsite sites. And we have our own email and kind of website pages. So there's a lot in the kind of the communication section where we've put some time and effort into. Next slide, please. Just looking at the kind of strategic approach. So yes, we have commissioned, I suppose, a needs assessment in terms of net gain based on our existing development allocations in our local plan, and also national infrastructure projects, because we have HS2, we have East-West Rail. So I think we wanted an idea of a very high level idea in terms of what the likely need was. And we've also indicated to our planning policy colleagues that that's an exercise that we think will need repeating when we look at future allocations in our emerging local plan. We have adopted net gain policies in our local plans. So in our legacy local plans, we assured that we inserted net gain policies in those probably 2 to 3 years ago. So there was work done back then to make sure that we got net gain policies into, I suppose, our legacy development management plans, which then referred to a subsequent approval of an SPD, which I will come on to. What has been really helpful was that obviously we were one of the pilot authorities for local nature recovery strategies, and that for me fundamentally highlighted the massively important link between these two policies, in that the local nature recovery strategy will strategically identify where, I suppose, those offset locations will go. So, you know, the map you can see there was a map we produced under our pilot, identifying the areas where we thought we made best sense to I suppose, identify or to create habitat. And that's the fundamental importance in terms of the link between the two. We have commissioned a review of our own land holdings, and then kind of shortlisted that with the state's colleagues. And I think what I would say for that, just in terms of firstly kind of creating boundaries between what you're doing from a regulatory point of view and in terms of obviously what we're doing in terms of what we might be doing with the open market. But what this has highlighted, where we've done this, we've gone and done survey work and then kind of costed up these, not all of them, these are going to be viable in terms of business case, potentially going into the market. So that's been an interesting perspective. And we might want to keep some of these back in terms of for our own development, because we do undertake our own development, and as a developer, we may need to find net gain offsite ourselves. So there are decisions to be made from that coming up, but we're kind of getting the evidence in place. Just going back very briefly to the local niche recovery strategy, all I would say, I'm conscious it's beneficial to us to be a responsible body for local nature recovery strategies and local planning authority. I'm conscious that if you're a district and a county council, you need to understand who your responsible authority is, and need to ensure from a net gain point of view, you're in very close contact with your responsible authority to ensure that kind of ties up. So that the link there is absolutely fundamental. Next slide, please. So I talked about how we inserted net gain policies into our local plans. So last year we published a supplementary planning document, which effectively provided guidance to, I suppose, planning applicants on what the Buckinghamshire process was, what information was required, what was our kind of flow chart in terms of decision making, and what are the options for local delivery in Buckinghamshire. So the intent was to provide clarity, to go early, and to provide a local process. So that was published last year, and we've been obviously using that since last year. Next slide, please. In terms of what's in it, again, we've really kind of stress the importance of the mitigation hierarchy, in that, we always, in terms of pushing back and making sure that on-site is always the first priority. So, we've now kind of reinforced that. That's the expectation of developers. And we then set out the three options if we are then going to, if we've exhausted that, and we are then going to the kind of off-site options. So until November 23 this year, there is the option to buy, I suppose, financial contribution to, I suppose, our own credits. So that's there until November to ensure that we weren't holding up development. The second and third option is the developer can find their own net gain site, or find a biodiversity net gain site through a broker or local habitat bank provider. So the SPD is very clear in terms of what the options are locally, and the kind of the routes that you'd have to go down to deliver that. So that's, I suppose, what's in the SPD in terms of that kind of clarity to our local development sector. Next slide, please. In terms of our support for development management, so whilst we kind of put the policy, I suppose, clarification in place, a lot of work has been put in place with our development management colleagues in terms of, I suppose, the tools and templates that are needed to support that. So with our legal colleagues, we developed a number of Section 106 templates for use where offsite biodiversity net gain is required, both in respect of a developer's coming forward with their own site, or whether they're going to use a habitat bank, for instance. We've also developed, and are almost at the point of completing, a template for use, a standalone template for use with habitat bank providers. And this again is where I kind of mentioned our kind of approach has changed. So we've kind of gone into a default mode of responsible body, akin to kind of conservation covenant, whereby we're looking to kind of enter into agreements with habitat bank providers to ensure that they can get onto the register when that becomes live. So we've pulled together a template, and obviously the information that needs to go into that. One thing of really importance, which I think is going to really help, is we've kind of published an interim guidance in terms of definition of strategic significance and spatial risk. So within the metric, obviously these are, I suppose, two of the variables. And I think to indicate what your interim guidance is on this, what does this mean locally, is going to, I suppose, help solve a lot of wrangling between developers and ecologists in terms of what does this mean locally. So yeah, so I think that's a really important one potentially to kind of look at, and just to clarify locally what it means, to provide a lot of toing and froing between kind of developers and ecologists. We've updated our local validation requirements, and we've put in place some work to set out our monitoring fee in terms of what we're going to charge. Now, clearly, we can only charge where there's a Section 106 in place for offsite biodiversity net gain. So yes, we have a charging mechanism for offsite at the moment, and we've kind of put that in place, and we've incorporated that into our kind of procedure notes. The other interesting, I suppose, tool that we have developed is a financial calculator to work out, I suppose, the detailed costings of local habitat creation and maintenance over a 30-year period. Originally, we'd kind of developed that for when we were then going to, I suppose, go out and, I suppose, run the scheme ourselves. Again, that's changed, and we're now using this, I think, to understand, as a habitat bank provider, have they costed it correctly from our point of view? Have they gone through? Is it credible what they're coming forward with? So I think it's been it's been different in terms of how we originally intended it, but it's been really helpful to verify some of the facts and figures that habitat bank providers are coming to it with, just to sense check. Next slide, please. And then just, I suppose, to support that development management, I suppose, all those tools, we've kind of pulled together a procedure note for our development management colleagues, recognising we're in a transition process, and recognising that this is going to change. We kind of send this round to our planners and ecologists. Again, it just sets out what the options are for biodiversity net gain, who does what the templates are, and the monitoring fees that apply. So and it changes, and we probably kind of recirculate this probably once every 2 months as things change. But that's been really helpful, just to provide clarity in terms of who's doing what and the impacts that are available. Next slide, please. Last couple of slides from me. So this has been a really interesting development on our part. I talked about habitat bank providers, and we're really keen to get our local offsite market up and running ahead of mandatory net gain. Hence why we've gone down the Section 106 route. And we've had lots of approaches from potential providers, and we were getting a little bit snowed under in terms of, right, how do we prioritise this? And they want to know how to engage with this as an authority. So very quickly, we then had to think, okay, that being the case, what is the criteria that we want, I suppose, if we are going to enter into a Section 106 with them? So we came up with a list, again, but just kind of problem solving. What is the information that we kind of need if we're going to enter a legal agreement with them? And this is just an indication of the list that we've kind of come up with. And I'm pretty sure this document has been circulated to PAS in terms of so that others can look at it. But does it comply with our strategic significant guidance? Have the various technical documents, have they done those? Have they got a cash flow model for 30 years that works? Have they done a kind of a detailed costing and management plan? It's been really good at screening out, I suppose, people whose thinking is less well developed, and has enabled us to engage with those who are serious, at the serious end of looking to get an offsite habitat bank on the ground. So that's been really helpful, and that's been a lot of where our focus has been over the last couple of months in terms of these more detailed negotiations, and that has led to this kind of template 106. It's kind of a de facto responsible body before, I suppose, the criteria for a responsible body has kind of come out. Next slide, please. Monitoring, enforcement and reporting, really important. And I kind of know we're kind of awaiting the guidance. So we've kind of done what we can on this. So, we've developed our monitoring fees calculator, as I mentioned, to be worked out for what, the resources that we need to be put in place for a 30-year period for those offset sites. So, we've kind of worked through that, and that's now being charged on those offset sites. I talked about the Habitat Bank work we're doing with Habitat Bank. So we've also worked out a fee that, because there's a lot of work to, I suppose, look at the information that's coming forward from Habitat Bank providers in terms of the management plans. And so, that takes time and effort. So there's a fee that we've put in place, I think, to do that. Yes, we're tracking our applications where offsite net gain is being required. And we've liaised with our Section 106 team in terms of, where those monitoring fees are going and how we make sure they come back to the ecology team. We've had initial discussions with planning enforcement in terms of this is coming. They are just initial discussions because, again, we're kind of awaiting for the guidance. But we've had those discussions, and the expectation that the planning system is going to be the primary mechanism in respect of enforcement. And just finally, in terms of, I suppose, reporting, we've had a meeting with IDOCs, as I expect maybe a number of you who use Uniform in terms of your planning systems, on their BNG module in terms of what information must be captured, both spatial information, but also quantitative, qualitative. We fed back some information, but again, I think that's really important that those providers are getting it right to help us in terms of the reporting and making that as easy as possible. So just finally, in terms of my final slide, just in terms of the summary, just ensure your local governance is in place. Just into even the internal governance in terms of how you're meeting in terms of officers. We've changed our approach, and we just recognise that was probably always going to be the case, and it may well change again as kind of the guidance kind of and regs kind of emerge. And I think we've just accepted that's it's kind of an emerging policy, and we're just working with it. Lots of the templates and guidance that I've referred to have been shared with PAS or on Basecamp. Developers are keen; they're on board. They want to do it. I think it's a positive message, but we keep discovering things we've not thought about. Political buy-in is really important. We've got political backing. They want to do more. They see how this is important. They see how this links in. So make sure you've got that political backing. And for us, the uncertainties are conservation covenants, enforcement and monitoring, but we've recognised that. And I think that's just that surety that there's lots of stuff you can do in terms of preparation without that full suite of guidance and secondary regs. And hoping that I've probably hit my time now, so I'm going to hand back to Errol just in terms of back to the main session.
That's fabulous. Thank you for that, David. Right now, so very, very interesting, and we've had a very lively chat. I think it's fair to say. We have selected some of the most popular questions that you put in the chat during the session, and we're now going to be asking our panel. So if I can ask our speakers, so if I can ask Catherine, Rebecca and David to kindly turn your cameras back on, and we will get started. I think the first question it's a three-parter. And it revolves around obviously the legislation when it comes in. And I think, first of all, have we got any clarification on when in November it will come in, and also if it will apply to non-determined applications at that time or any received after a certain date? Obviously, that's an unanswered question, I understand, with the legislation. If there's, I know we're waiting on secondary legislation, and is there any additional guidance on when that will be available? And third part of that same question is that, given those timeframes, and given that we haven't got a date, or may not have a date for the secondary legislation, is there any expectation that the timescales for implementation will be revised, given the amount of work still to be done on secondary legislation and guidance? Catherine, I think probably you're best to start that one.
Yes, but I might also call on somebody else in the as well as part of this as well. The first part of that was a date in November. Can't confirm a date in November at the moment. It's from from November at the moment. The exact date will be sort of confirmed in due course, but can't confirm a particular date at present. But it will be confirmed as soon as possible. Secondary legislation. So there is work going on at the moment to develop secondary legislation, and the aim again is to make that available as soon as possible. There will be further information. Obviously, there's a gov.uk collection page of existing guidance, and that will be added to. So there'll be further information being sort of added to over the summer on sort of particular aspects of biodiversity net gain. And the other one was about I think this has been answered in the chat by Laura Webster about sort of when it applies to applications, so new applications. But I think it's already in the chat, and there's a more comprehensive answer that I can give now. So I will leave it to what's in the chat.
No, absolutely fine. One of the questions we've had is the BNG sounds a bit like purchasing carbon credits. And how will anyone ever know what is really being achieved in terms of monitoring and enforcement within local authorities, as many of them do not have the expertise to address that?
Is that coming back to me? I think
I would say Catherine and then others. Or Becky.
Okay. So in terms of the obviously one of the key things that's been sort of a theme through the biodiversity sort of consultations has been transparency. That's one of the reasons why there will be this national register of biodiversity gain sites that will be publicly available, and so information will be sort of transparently available about all of the gains that should be being achieved. There's also a requirement within the Environment Act. I mentioned the NERC Act, the Enhanced NERC Act duty. So there is a sort of a duty and a reporting duty on sort of local authorities to report on sort of gains delivered or expected to be delivered within the reporting period. So I think sort of broadly there's a theme of sort of trying to make the information about biodiversity gains and what they should be sort of over that 30-year period publicly accessible to all.
Shall I just come in from a local authority perspective?
Yeah.
So in terms of offsite net gains, I think we're looking that we're going to have some pretty big strategic offsite sites hopefully being setting up, and I think that's why we've put in place the monitoring fees to ensure that whilst it's whoever's running those will be I suppose doing the monitoring, clearly we've got a verification process I suppose as part of that, checking what they're doing, assessing I suppose the reports that are kind of coming in, are they delivering the units that they should be doing. So I think we've recognised that we've costed that out for that 30-year period. So we've put that in place for off-site. I suppose we're less clear in terms of on-site at the moment, and I think that's for us is the on-site is the uncertainty at the moment. I'll finish there.
Yeah, if I could just come in as well, and just to say that's very much what we're hearing from other local authorities. So when we were preparing this readiness checklist that I've just talked through, we had a workshop last Wednesday, and just that thinking about how you're going to do the monitoring and preparing for that and trying to understand how you will fund it is going to be a really key thing. You're not going to be able to go and monitor check monitoring reports from every single site every time you get a monitoring report, but you might want to think of an approach to that and how you might do that and how you might fund that. So I think it's something that is coming out quite strongly, is sort of plan it in advance in terms of how you're going to do that, because you won't be able to do it for every single one. There's just no way.
No, I understand that. A few people have been asking about use class order and BNG offsite. And if you know which use class it would fall into, whether it be sui generis or F2 has also been suggested. I don't know whether, David, you've got any specific experience of that so far?
Not yet. I think what we've put down, so I can't answer that categorically. I think what we've put down in the habitat criteria is that clearly there are going to be other regulatory, I suppose, and licensing issues that a provider will need to satisfy themselves with, whether that be planning. And I think the onus is on them to kind of go through that. We've pulled together the criteria for them entering it into a kind of a standalone section 106. They may need to, I suppose, look at other licenses, so we've kind of put the onus on those to make sure they're satisfying that. The direct answer to the question is I don't know. Sorry.
I think there'll be a couple of legal opinions on that at some point, won't there? One of the questions is about the biodiversity metric calculation tool. I'm suggesting it's a cumbersome document. When we've received these as part of the submissions to date, they've become notoriously difficult to publish because of the type of document used. Is there any intention of Natural England to consider changing this to provide a more summary-based document, or an output-based document, or a web-based document, in order a more friendly, non-technical type output rather than a complicated spreadsheet? Would that be Catherine? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I can't speak on behalf of Natural
No, of
England.
course not.
Obviously, Natural England's tool, but just I think what we've has been sort of there's a theme throughout the what's come out from government, that there's an appreciation that sort of digitisation or increased digitisation over time would sort of facilitate and help, and particularly as biodiversity net gain sort of starts and sort of works into practice, and there's several people really looking at sort of how they can sort of develop tools off the back of biodiversity net gain. So I think it's an awareness that sort of it's something that could be developed further in time. But yeah, obviously can't speak for Natural England.
No, absolutely no. One of the questions is, how do you reasonably measure design opportunities on site have been exhausted before jumping to purchase off-site units? Which obviously that would have an impact on result in more development, sterile development, and obviously reducing the opportunities for BNG on your development. I don't know whether, David, you've had any experience of that so far?
So we're thinking back to the work, I suppose, we did a couple of years ago. So when we were kind of introducing this, we looked at a couple of retrospective planning applications to say, could we have, and we looked at from a small development all the way up to a much larger one, could we have retrofitted, or what would kind of been the process to kind of get net gain on site? And clearly it was possible to do that. I think we worked with our kind of urban designers to say, you know, could the design have been changed to make sure that biodiversity gain was on site, and clearly it could. So I think we satisfied ourselves that, you know, we can push back, you know, knowing this policy was kind of coming in, and certainly that's the approach that we've adopted. And now that we've been really clear is that we're expecting that, you know, we are pushing back with confidence to say, you know, and it's an iterative process, and our SPD says that as well, to say, you know, in terms of the iterative design. So clearly, if it can't be done, then yes, we're into off-site. But we did satisfy ourselves very early on in the process that those developments could have had net gain on site.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've also been asked, why is permitted development exempt? In urban areas, we really need to continue protecting and enhancing biodiversity. Any thoughts on that?
So it was something that was, I think, one of the exemptions that was highlighted very early on for the policy. So that and householder development. So yeah, they are exempt from mandatory biodiversity net gain. Yeah, from very on.
No, fine. Specifically, David, any advice on the approach to commissioning a needs assessment that gives a steer? Appreciated, quite challenging to get anything too accurate.
Agree. So it's only ever going to be high level. So we used the provider. So we'd done quite a lot of work in respect to natural capital mapping. So we were just lucky to we engaged the company that did our natural capital mapping to do, I suppose, our needs assessment. So we kind of provided our layers from our development plan. It is always going to be high level because you've got to make assumptions in there in terms of how much offsite, but it clearly indicates a demand. And I think, you know, again, it's something to think through with our planning policy colleagues when you're kind of looking at our local plan. We've already highlighted that to our planning policy colleagues that we're going to need to do that in terms of future allocations. But we were lucky, we had a relationship with an existing contractor that we were able to ask to do that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And we've had one question saying, do landowners get paid for creating a habitat and offering it in the off-site bank? I know there was another question that actually referred to whether there's been a high level look at the impact on kind of things like food production as a consequence of that sort of activity. Again, anybody got any thoughts on that?
So in terms of sort of off-site provision, there's been a couple of things. There's been a market analysis study that's online that was looking at the supply and demand for off-site units and sort of the pricing of those. More broadly, in the food strategy last year, the government committed to a land use framework, publishing a land use framework this year. So that's something that we'll be sort of considering different impacts and things on land use. That obviously links up to land use and local nature recovery strategies and where things are. So yeah, I think there's several things going on. But in terms of the expected land take, there is I'll put it in the chat, but there is other analysis that's been completed about the like sort of different scenarios for sort of likely amount of land required for biodiversity net gain offsites, sort of depending on sort of market activity and things. So I'll put that in the chat.
That'd be absolutely fabulous. And one of the final questions.
I was just going to say, Errol was just Louise has answered in the chat about landowners getting paid, but yes, they will get paid to do that. So I think Louise has covered that.
Fabulous, thank you. And there's a couple of questions about affordable housing, and has the impact of biodiversity net gain on affordable housing been assessed at all? And if so, where's that published? So maybe there's a link we can share.
So there was an impact assessment done at the beginning of the policy that looked at sort of the cost and benefits of bringing in the policy. It sort of looked at various costs and benefits of a mandatory approach to biodiversity net gain. Obviously, it's already it was a policy within the NPPF already. So this is, but yeah, I think I've included a link in that already. But there is some information there. But it will be very case, I think in terms of viability, obviously sort of very case specific, depending on where the site is.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about this in the sort of wider policy balance. And, because it's mandatory, it will be legally required. You can't push back on that mandatory requirement. And there have been some concerns raised, particularly by some urban local authorities around affordable housing. I think it is worth pushing back. I've been to quite a few conferences where actually developers have pushed back a little bit on that and said that it's not necessarily the impact you think on affordable housing. And I think it is worth really thinking about, we know that areas with deprivation are really suffering from lack of access to nature. And so there's something about, should we be building affordable housing without access to nature? So I'm not saying that there aren't some viability issues there, but I would say that, what I would like to really see is a way to address those in the whole, rather than let's balance them off against each other. Let's try and do both. And how do we make both both viable, rather than assuming that we can only have one or the other, given how important we know that both nature and providing affordable housing for people it is.
No, absolutely. I think this question has been answered in the chat, but I think there's a follow-on that we can probably do, and that's can local planning authorities require BNG on sites gaining planning before November? The person's asked to have an affordable site which has just gained consent and 10% BNG, and that's been made a condition. I understand that that's been answered, and it refers to obviously being in the local plan. But one of the other questions that has come out is the conflict between a local plan policy for requirement of BNG if it's higher than 10%, and obviously the mandatory net gain requirement of 10%, and about which one would take precedent in that scenario. I don't know whether you have any thoughts on that, or you've been given
I can answer that, Errol. Yeah. So I mean, basically, as I just said, the 10% and the mandatory requirements are mandatory and they're legally required. They don't come into the policy balance. Now, what your local plan requirements are will be part, if they're above and beyond the 10%, they will be part of the policy balance. So potentially they could be challenged if other things, and with any as planners are used to making decisions, you would have to make decisions on that. And so that's why, as part of our checklist, one of the key points is reviewing your local plan and understanding how it fits. Now, actually, a lot of net gain policies that are out already don't go above and beyond. And they actually, they don't set out a percentage and things. So it's likely that actually that legal requirement in a lot of places will be above what's in the local plan, in the adopted local plan. So, but basically that legal requirement is, it's a bare minimum. You definitely have to do that. And then anything above and beyond that will come into the policy balance. But it is worth thinking in developing policy around how you can, encourage various things to be delivered locally and how you can link into local strategies and things, you know, because that's not something that's particularly challengeable. And, you know, thinking about BNG in the context of your local plan and delivering the wider objectives and vision is, you know, really key. So, yeah.
No, absolutely fabulous. Thank you, Rebecca. That's really, really useful, really, really interesting. I think we're getting to the end of the session, so I think I'm going to just do the wrap up. Thank you all for your time and your contributions. Particularly thank you to our speakers, to Catherine, to Becky and David, and for everyone who's attended the session and made it such an interesting and engaging session. There's just lastly a couple of take-home slides. We're going to send the slide pack around after the session, but that will include, so like I say, some take-home messages and some links to some future learning, and we'll add in the links that have already gone in the chat through the conversation that we've had today. But for now, I will leave you back to your day. Thank you very much and goodbye.